Well, thanks, Amanda. Good afternoon. It's delightful to be back with you. I think there's two things happening in the equity markets. The first is a more secular trend, and I think to understand that, what we have to do is to understand equity markets in relation to other markets, across fixed income, et cetera. And the reality is that today, with the real interest rates as low as they are, with the risk-free rate essentially approaching zero, the value of future cash flows today is essentially the same as the value of those cash flows at some future date, because the discount rate being zero, $10 down the road is the same as $10 today. So that's part of what's lifting all boats in these markets. And then, obviously, as you just mentioned, there's also a degree of enthusiasm for reopening. I think that those both of those things are potentially very transitory in nature. And I think investors have to be very cautious here.
And obviously, there are lots of factors that'll be at play here, Mark. And I know, you've spent so much of your career thinking longer term, not in these kind of short-term gyrations. But when you look at some of the things that are driving the enthusiasm, including the good news, there's no question it is good news from Moderna on the path towards some potential vaccine. It does feel a little exuberant. Are there parts of the market that feel, despite everything you just said about sort of the asset valuation, and that's just a reality, are there parts that feel a little saner to you than others?
Well, look, I think I'm going to go back to some comments that I've made in the past about thinking long term. We know that markets and the economy in general, insofar as we can keep our companies alive, keep that heart beating, we know that this will come to an end. The question is, when will it come to an end? What is the epidemiological outcome that will allow it to come to an end? And the consumer will recover and markets will recover, but I don't believe that they will recover until such time as people feel safe. It doesn't really matter what governments can say, and we've seen this in some cases in some of the U.S. states like Georgia. If governments say that businesses reopen, that doesn't matter. People have to feel safe. People have to be in a position where they can have the confidence to go back to living what we would call sort of normal life. And that isn't going to happen, in my view, for a period of time. Those businesses that can survive until we can return to normal, I believe will benefit greatly, because there will be a normal. We will come out of this, and this is what I've been saying all along. But we are going to be, I think, in a prolonged period, no matter how good the news is around a vaccine, no matter how good outcomes are in the short term epidemiologically, we're not going to be out of this until people ultimately feel safe.
And I mean, on that front, obviously, we're seeing different methodologies being used across Canada, for instance, let alone across the U.S. on the path to reopening, Mark. Do you worry about, I mean, obviously, everybody's worried about a second wave, and that is, in some ways beyond our control. But do you feel as though we're doing what we need to do to test enough, to track enough, to, monitor in such a way that keeps that possibility at least as contained as possible?
Well, look, I'm not an epidemiologist or an infectious disease specialist, so I know as much as I read in the papers. But it would seem to me that testing and tracing has got to be a major part of the answer here. We have to continue to test. We have to ramp that up as much as we can. And then we have to trace those cases to try and control the spread. I think by and large, Canadians have done a good job. We've been responsible. We've socially distanced. We've stayed at home. And as we reopen, however, we need to be in a position that we have as much information as possible, and public health officials have as much information as possible, to ensure that those embers that are still out there, another 400 plus confirmed cases today in Ontario, for example, that those embers don't reignite into a fire, let alone an inferno. And it would seem to me that putting more and more effort into continued testing and tracing those cases so that we can cut it off at the pass is incredibly important. And countries that have been successful, whether it be Korea or Singapore, which have done it largely through technology, or countries like Germany that have done it through more human means of sort of brute force contact tracing, we've got to employ those methods here if we want to not only reopen, but remain open.
One area in this country that was besieged long before this, Mark, as you well know, was our energy sector. Multiple issues there. And then last week, Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund identifying some major players in the oil sands that it will divest. How big a blow is that? And where do you think the investor sentiment lies around our energy sector?
Well, look, what I would say is that sustainability has not gone away for major institutional investors. The importance of sustainability, the importance in the long run of environmental, social, and governance factors to institutional investors around the world was on the rise before the COVID-19 crisis struck. And I don't think any of those trends have changed. What's really important for people to understand here is that looking at ESG factors in investing, it's not about someone's value set. It's not about sort of a moralistic viewpoint necessarily. I believe that in the long run, that values and value converge. Those companies that do a better job in terms of focusing on the importance of sustainability in their business models, focus on the importance of their supply chain, focuses on their carbon footprint, those companies will perform better in terms of profitability going forward. So yes, you are seeing movements, particularly around endowments and folks like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund who are divesting. I actually think it goes much deeper than that. And I think we have to begin to take it much more seriously in terms of disclosure. And I believe that Canadian companies who want to succeed in the long run have to put sustainability at the core of their business model, because that is what is going to make them more profitable in the future. And we're showing time and again the companies that do a better job having good practices around ESG are the companies that are more valuable in the long term. And investors are understanding that today, too.
I mean, Mark, you and I both know that Canadian energy companies, Albertan energy companies are at the forefront of reporting, of reducing their carbon output, of reducing their footprint. They are in an inherently carbon-heavy business. It's one the world happens to still need. Do you think that given that many investors will make this choice, even though on a relative basis these companies are better than many, should our own pension funds, and I'm asking you as the former head of CPPIB, should Canadian pension funds be throwing their weight behind Canadian energy companies right now in a new way if global ones will not?
Look, I think it is, again, it is a question of where is value. And I believe there's a lot of value in the Canadian energy sector today. And I think Canadian pension funds have an obligation to find the best risk-weighted returns for their beneficiaries that they can. And I would suggest today there is a significant value in the Western Canadian Basin and in Canadian companies who are operating in that basin. What we also have to do, though, is find a way, and we have to do it quickly, and we have to do it with a high degree of deliberateness, is find a way to get Canadian product to global markets. We saw the announcement from Senator Biden as it relates to Keystone. We've got to think about getting Trans Mountain built. Canadians have paid a lot of money to purchase that asset. We have to make sure that it gets built, and we also have to look at supplying the East Coast as well. Until we do that, good Canadian companies who are producing energy responsibly, in many cases are producing energy with a very low carbon footprint, aren't going to have an ability to get their product to market. And I think investors, in many respects, are waiting to see that before they'll put money back into the sector. That's, to me, where the uncertainty is. It is about finding that outlet for supply, as opposed to issues about carbon footprint, et cetera, where I think we've made great progress.